Welcome to Authentically, Debz, a podcast about a Southern girl looking at 70. Okay, guys, here we go. Again, I'm Deborah Jan Gray. I'm an actor. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. I'm a producer. I'm probably a lot of other things too. But one thing I want you to know is that I just turned 70. And that feels so big. I don't know what the fuck it means, really. But it does feel big. Anyway, I'm going to start at the beginning. But I do need to tell you that, first off, I think I've had several lifetimes here on Earth. I believe in reincarnation. So that means I may have had hundreds of lifetimes here, even thousands. But I do want this to be my last reincarnation on this planet. Beam me up, Scotty. But hey, there is intelligent life here, if you really look for it. And I'm quite sure I have more lessons to learn. Darn it. Anyway, I was born into the bowels of the South in 1950 in Shreveport, Louisiana. You know, locals call it Louisiana. People that aren't from there usually say Louisiana. I was born to older parents. I'm an only child. My parents divorced when I was 2, but their story is for another show. And by the way, nobody got divorced back then. But my parents did. I was raised by my mother, my maternal grandmother, and 3 of my mother's sisters in my grandmother's old southern home at the edge of the little town where we lived called Haynesville. But again, we called it Haynesville. And my 3 aunts didn't actually live with us. They lived in their own homes, but they visited every day for afternoon coffee and had a lot to do with my upbringing when I was little. I think Haynesville was named after a Confederate officer. It had a population of about 2,000, and so far, as long as I've been alive, I don't think that's ever changed. I'm surprised they've even been able to maintain it. Everyone in Haynesville used to work for the oil fields, and particularly Halliburton. But then there was just a glove factory, and now I really don't know that there's anything because I haven't been back in a long, long time. And by the way, they still, I know, do grow football players there, really. I mean, how else can you explain having a state championship football team in such a small town? And we're talking about a span of about 30 years. And maybe 2 different coaches is all. And way before the schools were integrated, the white high school football program, which in itself wasn't all that good, but they would draft players who were not necessarily from Haynesville and were not necessarily in high school, but were working in the oil fields around Haynesville. So that's one way to get a state championship with a town of 2,000. But once the schools integrated, oh my God, the talent that came out of Haynesville. Several of them have gone to the NFL. are there today, as a matter of fact. I'll mention that I did get to see Peyton Manning play high school football from his private school in southern Louisiana near New Orleans against Haynesville. We beat Peyton Manning's team, but I have never seen a high school quarterback pass or throw the way Peyton did. It was an amazing experience. And during that game, I don't think Haynesville ran one pass play. We were strictly a running team that year. And we beat them. What can I say? Okay. I lived happily and ignorantly in the Jim Crow South. I was well loved and brainwashed by pretty much all the racists who surrounded me. I will say that I think my parents were less racist than my other relatives and most of the people in Haynesville, if for no other reason than they traveled more. And Mark Twain said something like this: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. So I think that means that even today, most of the white people in Haynesville, and probably down south in general, need to take a long vacation. My dad became career Air Force after flying fighter sorties in World War II in North Africa, and then later in the Korean theater of war. He loved those fighter jets. My mother was a different bird for sure. She went to at least 10 different colleges or universities across the South, as well as the West and Midwest. And she was also a definite party girl, which would naturally follow, I guess. Yet, and I would stake my life on this, she finally married my dad at 38 as a virgin. She was a different kind of party girl. She even told me in my teens that, frankly, sex isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Well, Mom, speak for yourself, or those used to be my words. And hopefully we'll be again someday soon. She used to also tell me as a teenager, out of concern for my being a real loner, which I still am, you need to go to parties, have some fun, because these really are the best days of your life. She meant it. And I guess that was kind of sad for her, because she really did have a lot of fun growing up at parties, even if she didn't have sex. Both of my parents were alcoholics. So am I. So is my ex-husband. I've just been married once. So are at least one of my 2 children, daughters, and one of my 3 grandchildren is a recovering addict, and one is a depressive. Addiction sort of came at my immediate family from all directions. And my family is just now beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Some of us anyway. As for me, I'm moving on. I've done all I can for all of them, and I wish them well. God knows I love them. As a little girl, I remember my relatives, not my parents, but my relatives, calling Dr. Martin Luther King a criminal and accusing him of bringing all of those damn Yankees and northern niggers down south. It was their fault. They said we didn't have any problems with our niggers before that. Truly, it was sort of like being raised by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Trump supporters. But that is the language that I heard a lot of growing up. Now, my family were all very nice to me. A little white girl. And they were so racist. We never locked our cars at night. We left the keys in our cars overnight. After all, who would want to hurt us? The bad news is, who could? And I found out later that my deceased maternal grandfather was a Ku Klux Klan member. No big surprise there. And two of my uncles owned local businesses. One had a gas station, and I remember, I think we also call it a filling station. And I remember he sold gas, but where he really made his money was selling tires. And I remember at that gas station that there were 3 restrooms. One said men, one said ladies, and the third restroom said colored. My other uncle had the local Dairy Queen. And there were 2 front service windows for whites only, and only one on the side, and that one said colored. I thought that's just the way it was, if I even thought about it at all, because at that time, that was my world. And aside, kind of random, but one of those uncles used to always kiddingly say to me, "Oh, Debbie, I saw you hesitating behind that tree." A genius he wasn't. Most racists aren't. But he always found that incredibly funny. I didn't. I found it embarrassing because I didn't know what that word meant. And I guess there was no dictionary or Google. Where was my mother, who would later become an English teacher? Every Sunday, my mother, myself, my grandmother, my 3 aunts and their husbands, and their kids would all have dinner at my grandmother's house. And I'm calling it dinner, but it was actually lunch because it was at noon. But we called lunch dinner, and the evening meal was supper, which usually just consisted of leftovers. But Sunday dinner was a big deal in my family, and everybody came to my grandmother's for that meal. My grandmother had a cook and housekeeper named Nobi. She had been in the family long before I was born. And Nobi made the entire dinner from scratch, including fried chicken, all sorts of wonderful vegetables. My grandmother had a vegetable garden, and I can even, in the back of the house, because we lived on the edge of town, and I can even remember a man with a hoe and a mule, not a hoe, with a plow and a mule, plowing up the garden every season. We also had some cows, and we had some Shetland ponies too. And I used to love riding them. And after I rode those ponies, I would go in the house and Nobi had made homemade bread. I don't know why I connect riding the Shetland ponies with having the homemade bread, buttered homemade bread. But I do, and it was a magnificent memory. Anyway, getting back to the Sunday dinner, Nobi prepared everything. I remember as a little girl watching Nobi maybe earlier Sunday morning or maybe even another day of the week. We also had a chicken yard in the backyard, and Nobi would grab 2 chickens by their neck, and she would wring their necks, just swinging with both arms until both of the heads of those chickens came off. And then the body of the chicken would just be jumping around on the ground until death, I thought, and then she would bring them in to the house. But one day, I was in the kitchen after she had brought them in, and one was in the sink, and honest to God, I don't know if she brought a rooster in instead of a hen by mistake, but I heard coming from that headless chicken rooster animal. It was scary. Okay, again, back to Sunday dinner. All of the grown folks ate in the big kitchen table area. The kids, strangely enough, ate in the dining room around that big table. Kind of weird, but that's the way it was. Well, after we all ate, then after Nobi cleaned up after everyone, she finally got to sit down and eat. And I remember that I usually always ate again with her because it was just really fun eating with Nobi and talking, much more so than it was with the boring white people. So after Nobi had cleaned up and had finished eating herself, then always someone from our family, whether it be my mother, an aunt or uncle, I don't think it was ever my grandmother, she didn't drive much, would volunteer to take Nobi home. And I generally always made it a point to ride with whoever was taking Nobi home that day. And no one ever asked me why I wanted to go on that drive. But it was because I got to see another world, a separate world from mine. I got to see the quarters, or what my relatives call the nigger quarters. It was fascinating to me. There I saw people, all black people, in mostly rundown houses, but not all, just living their lives, families, as if we white folks didn't exist. Thankfully, I'm sure. We dropped Nobi off at, without a doubt, the most rundown shack in all of the quarters. And there were some rundown houses there, but Nobi won the prize. Looking back, I think that fact must have been a kind of banner for my fucked up family. You would think that after at least 30 years of service to our white family, someone in my family, especially the grown men, could have fixed up her home, or at least hired someone to do it so that it was at least habitable. But Jesus, I guess not. So every Sunday afternoon, after dropping Nobi off at her shack, whoever was driving would almost always drive by this one house that was very nice and had a lovely manicured yard. And almost every week, a little black boy who lived there and was about my age would be outside playing. I couldn't have been over 7 or 8 tops. This was my favorite part of the weekly drive, and that was my only real purpose in taking the drive, so that I could flirt with that little black boy mercilessly at my tender age of 8. For one thing, I knew, because of white people's racist language, that this was forbidden. That much I knew. But just as importantly, I could honestly, definitely already feel, even at that young age, my budding sexuality. I didn't know why back then, but now I'm relatively sure that this little boy's parents had told him, for his own protection, not to ever talk to white children, or white people for that matter, unless you're spoken to. So here's what happened. Every time I saw him in the yard, I would flirt with him. And his eyes would honestly become big as saucers. Now, by flirting, I just mean smiling at him, grinning at him, making provocative faces at him, like batting my eyelashes or even throwing him a kiss. And my relative who was driving the car never caught me doing that. But if I had gotten caught, I'm quite sure at that time I would have lied and blamed everything on that little boy. My God, looking back, I was blatantly putting that child's life in imminent danger. After all, this was the Jim Crow South. God forgive me, for I knew not what I did. However, one can already see by my admission here that I had already been indoctrinated. Today we might call it radicalized. When I was 10 years old, I had my first nervous breakdown. I now know that was the first of my many manifestations of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a lifelong disorder that I continue to suffer from, but have had to learn to cope with. Looking back, for the most part, the hard way. Up until relatively recently, when I decided to do some research in my late 40s, early 50s, discovering that was what I had, and that was what I had been struggling with my whole life to that point. I found a good shrink who verified it and even gave me some medication that has actually helped. But I had to deal with it on my own for basically the first 50 years of my life. And folks, it wasn't easy, and it often wasn't pretty. OCD is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as one of the 3 top mental illnesses, the other 2 being bipolar and schizophrenia. But OCD definitely gets less press than the other two, but I deem it just as serious. A famous case that probably most of you, older people and some real well-read younger people would remember is that of Howard Hughes, who I think really had one major obsession, and that was cleanliness, which, as it turned out, rendered him isolated, reclusive, and he ultimately died of OCD. He dealt with that obsession by compulsing with his weird obsessive cleanliness, isolation, reclusiveness, and ultimately death. He may have had many obsessions, and other than just the cleanliness, and one I think was that plane that he built called a Spruce Goose, and at that time it was the largest plane ever built, may still be. I think its total wingspan was 2 football stadiums. The obsession was the plane, and no one had ever seen such a monstrosity. He dealt with that obsession, the plane, by compulsing, which is the other part of OCD, by flying it once. The thing with OCD is that you have an obsession, something you think about so much that you really feel like your head is going to explode. So you have to do something to deal with that obsession. And people do different things. He just happened to, for the most part, do the cleanliness thing. And that's what ultimately killed him. So you obsess and then you compulse to stop the obsession. But the compulsion becomes equally bad and often worse than the obsession. You can find success at times with OCD, which an example would have been that plane that he built and flew once. And as a teacher, I've just found OCD, I found the compulsions I can use for OCD to really help me juggle a lot of things, but it's not recommended, and with the medication I take, I don't do that much anymore at all. There's one other case of OCD that I wanted to mention to you. And this was another real person, not as famous as Howard Hughes. She was infamous because of what she did. This probably happened maybe about 20 years ago. This was a young mother who killed her 5 young children. It did make the national news. She lived in Texas. Seems like she lived near Houston, but I'm not sure. A lot of weird, horrible things have happened in Texas, just saying. But I remember that when they would show her on the news, on the TV news, she had long brown hair. And I couldn't help but notice that she had rather large blotches of baldness all over her scalp. She had kind of thin hair to begin with. It was very long, and then she would just have just big blotches of baldness. And that is what is called trichotillomania, which is a category of OCD in which intense anxiety from the obsession causes a person to literally compulse by pulling out, in her case, large amounts of hair. It stood out, it looked very weird, yet I never heard it mentioned. And of course, I cannot validate that. But I'm quite sure that's what she had. Now, she was certainly psychotic, crazy. I mean, who would kill their own children? And she may have had other forms of mental illness, but like I say, I believe she definitely had OCD. And I believe I read about that it was her belief that she and her children were possessed by the devil, and that would be the obsession, resulting in first her compulsion of pulling out swaths of her own hair, and may later have led to a more deadly compulsion of taking the lives of her 5 babies. Possibly the only way she knew at the time to deal with that horrible obsession that her children were all devils. And that noise was my washing machine. No, my dryer. Again, this is all speculation on my part, and I think she ultimately ended up in a mental institution after at first being convicted and at first going to prison. Then they realized that she was just completely psychotic. So there are many types of obsessions from OCD. For me, and I will get into more detail soon, I tended to move from one obsession to another. I didn't just stick with one. That can also be the way the disease is. And I've read about this and I've experienced this. I would sometimes obsess when driving my car that I had hit someone. And I would have to drive around the block again to convince myself that it wasn't true. And I don't know why in the world I would think it was true, but I did. That was the obsession. And the compulsion was to keep driving around to see if you could find who you hit. And God knows if you actually had hit someone, what you would do about it. But I never, ironically, obsessed about cleanliness. Go figure. But that was one obsession that I did have for a short time. And, you know, sometimes I still don't do it much anymore, but I can obsess about not having locked my house when I leave for work and having to come back to check when I know that I did lock my house. But, you know, sometimes OCD wins out. Not usually anymore, but sometimes. So let's get back to my first nervous breakdown. And let me say also at this time that OCD was one important reason that I've made such bizarre choices in my life, especially in the early quarter century of my life, which almost killed me, but simultaneously also saved me. So, as Carolyn Miss, a wonderful spiritual leader, I would say, has said that her prayer is, God, hover over me. I think God did hover over me, which is the only reason I'm still alive and kicking and here to do this podcast. My first obsession when I was 10 was insomnia. And all I knew and all I felt was that I could no longer sleep at night. And I began obsessing about it to the point that I didn't even try to sleep because it made me so nervous and anxious to the point of nausea. And then I remember a period of months, not weeks, that I simply became very depressed. I never felt good. I didn't want to be around any of my friends, and that's what my family noticed. I wasn't ever hungry, and I could often be found sitting on the large sofa in my grandmother's living room just staring into space. Well, it scared my poor mother to death because her own gregariousness had often saved her from her own depths of mental illness. Being around her friends, she was very popular, and remember, she was that party girl. And I actually found out much later that she also suffered from mental illness. I would say at least OCD. But at any rate, had also had what people call back then a nervous breakdown. And I literally had to pull that information out of my aunts after my mother's death because they didn't even want to touch on the subject of anyone having a nervous breakdown, especially no one in their family. It's like in the South, you do what you do, but don't scare the horses. Her family or my family would literally rather a member die rather than deal with the taboo subject of mental illness. In fact, a younger cousin of mine did commit suicide at age 32, which they said because he was always so unhappy, not to mention a depressive and an alcoholic. So what I want to get back to is me. And I think that what my mother saw me experiencing reminded her of what she had also experienced. Thanks for listening to Authentically, Debz. If you like the show, please check out my website and leave us a review.